Hi, this lesson will cover Chapter 2 from the Healthy Living text, which is regarding psychological health. Psychological health is a very important component of your holistic health and can certainly have an effect on a person's physical health as well. So we will talk about that connection in this chapter, and we will also touch on some fairly common psychological disorders and just sort of give a brief overview of each. We're not going to get super in depth to any of those. That would be more for a psychology class. Psychology is the study of the mental and cognitive processes that influence human behavior. And psychological health and how it deals with holistic health is the ability to deal effectively with psychological challenges in life. It can become sort of more positive or negative as one responds to a changing environment, and sort of how a person responds to those changes in either a positive or negative way can have an effect on their health. So again, one's psychological health will affect other components of health, especially their social health, their spiritual health, and most definitely their physical health as well. This list is characteristics of psychologically healthy people. I'm not going to read this list to you. You can pause this and take a look at the list. It is also found on page 40 in your textbook. Do keep in mind that psychology is an ever-changing field. It is constantly in flux and fluid, and people aren't always going to respond the same way to every situation. So again, these are just sort of general characteristics that psychologically healthy people typically tend to have. So again, as far as affecting our overall health, when we think of psychology, a lot of times we think about the brain and how it's involved. And that is part of the central nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cords. The peripheral nervous system is made up of all the other nerves located throughout the body. Our mind, we think about, this is where we usually have like higher level thinking, processing disorders. It is part of the brain, but it's more of how we think and how we respond, which then shapes our personality as well. So all of these things sort of act together to make up our psychological health. Personality is defined as a set of distinct thoughts and behaviors, including emotional responses that characterize how we respond to situations. So everyone has a unique personality. We may, change our mood from day to day or depending on what situation that we're in, but a personality is generally predictable. Think about how you would describe someone or even describe yourself, and those are a lot of our personality traits. So your temperament or your personality is, again, just sort of the predictable way that you respond. There are a lot of different influences on personality, and those can include biological influences such as genetics and heredity, what's passed down from family members, cultural, how you are brought up and raised, which goes into social and psychological as well, interactions with family members and friends, and really anyone that you encounter growing up, and then learning from experiences, being exposed to different experiences sort of shape our personality. We're going to talk about a couple of different theories, psychological theories of personality and human development, basically. I don't need you guys to know a lot of the specifics about them, sort of recognize the names. These are pretty big names in psychology, and just have a sort of general idea of what their theory was as far as personality development. So Sigmund Freud is the first one. And he believed that the unconscious mind influenced behaviors. He believed that people develop defense mechanisms, which are ways of thinking and behaving that can help to reduce or eliminate anxiety when we're in anxious, inducing situations. They can also alter a person's perception of reality. These are all listed on the next slide, so we'll go into them a little bit there, but these are things like denial and projection. Defense mechanisms protect the mind against psychological conflicts and threats. So if we look at the next slide, some different defense mechanisms, like I mentioned, denial, which is the third one listed here. That is refusing to acknowledge unpleasant situations or feelings, So an example would be a young man doesn't accept the fact that he's been diagnosed with a terminal illness. It's kind of an extreme example, but you get the idea. Let's see, projection, which is the next one. Taking unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or urges and sort of projecting them onto someone else. So a woman accuses her boyfriend of being unfaithful while repressing her desire to have an affair. Again, another extreme example, but those would be some examples of defense mechanisms or sort of coping mechanisms. And these, again, can be attributed to Freud and some of his thoughts about how our personalities develop. Erickson was another psychologist, and his thoughts on personality development are that social influences are going to shape your personality, and that as we grow, and you can see in this chart here, he has psychosocial stages of development. During different times in your life, you go through sort of different developing processes. So individuals are going to progress through each of these 8 stages, and each stage has a crisis or a conflict that has to be resolved or managed if one is to achieve a sense of psychological well-being. So your emotional well-being is achieved through conflict resolution. So again, in very early age, babies are learning to trust and mistrust. Who can they trust? Who maybe can they not trust? As we go down, identity versus confusion, intimacy versus isolation. So as we start to age, we start to deal with some of these different conflicts, and how we choose to deal with them, again, help to shape our personality. The last one is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and he believed that behavior is value-driven, that humans have some basic needs that need to be met, and if those needs aren't met, then you typically can't progress to the higher level needs. And personality development is driven by the need to achieve psychological fulfillment or self-actualization. So he thought people behaved based on their values, not on their subconscious. And again, this was his diagram of a hierarchy of needs. So you think, or look down here, the most basic needs: air, water, food, housing, sleep, safety needs. So what basic needs are met, then we need to be able to keep ourselves safe, love, companionship, relationships, esteem, and then finally self-actualization after that. Psychological adjustment is just being able to adjust to the demands of life and the stresses that come up in everyday life. And I'm sure we can all attest to the fact, your college students, there's stress involved with that, balancing school and work and family and everything else. It does take some adjustment and some growth. So psychological growth occurs when a person learns that certain adjustment strategies enhance his or her sense of freedom and control over self and the environment. So you've got to kind of figure out what works for you, and everyone's going to be a little bit different here. Interpersonal conflicts can hinder a person's psychological adjustment and growth. Aggressive reactions are reactions that can have harm or do harm to other people. Assertive reactions are basically asserting yourself and maintaining your rights without infringing on the rights of others or harming others. So psychological growth is sort of trying to build that assertiveness and fosters the development of autonomy, that's self-control, self-worth, which is also associated with self-esteem. So self-esteem is a feeling that one is worthy and useful. It influences your thoughts, reactions, your feelings, and it begins to develop pretty early in childhood. It does remain fairly constant over time and can be greatly influenced by caretakers. Again, because it starts so young, whoever is taking care of that child is going to have a pretty big influence on that child's self-esteem. Self-esteem is a key component of personality. It can change over time, and it's often based on the environment in which the person is functioning. So here are some of the differences between sort of a positive or high self-esteem and low self-esteem. Someone who has more of a positive self-esteem would display autonomy or independence. They're self-confident, they accept challenges, they work well with others, they can easily adapt to change, and they accept responsibility. On the flip side, people with low self-esteem generally have difficulty making decisions. They don't like change or changing behaviors. They resent any form of criticism, and they put down others to make themselves feel better. So just taking a look at those lists and just sort of reflecting a little bit. How would you rate your own self-esteem? Where do you think you fall in that spectrum? So just think about that. How to improve psychological health. Lifestyle behaviors, things such as getting regular exercise, getting enough sleep, eating a nutritious diet, can have an effect on your psychological health. They most definitely have an effect on a person's physical health, and we'll get to all that in some later chapters, but they can also play into psychological health. Some people use exercise as a stress relief, right? If they're going through a very stressful time or anxious time, sometimes running or performing some type of exercise, weightlifting, helps to sort of burn off some of that steam or stress. Improving intellectual health and spiritual needs can help foster someone's psychological health as well. Social contacts and protecting the quality of your environment. So again, this is basically looking at some of those other aspects of holistic health and making sure that they are all healthy and intact, to make sure that psychological health is going to be healthy as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about mental illness or psychological illness. And so occasionally, even healthy people have disturbing thoughts, experience unpleasant feelings, or display inappropriate behaviors. But the key to that is that it is only occasionally. They typically use coping strategies to deal with it. They get through it. They move on. Mentally ill individuals have abnormal feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that persist. So again, that's one big key difference. These feelings last much longer than they would for a typical person. They even interfere with daily life, and they will certainly hinder psychological adjustment and growth. So again, we're going to go over some of the major psychological illnesses, and again, just kind of touch on them and give you sort of a brief understanding. Psychosis is a severe type of mental illness. It's very disorganized thoughts, unreal perceptions that result in strange behavior, isolation, delusions, possibly, and hallucinations as well. Delusions are inaccurate and unreasonable beliefs that result in decision-making errors. An example of this would be a person has the delusion that they can fly, so they jump off a tall building. Obviously, that is not a logical choice to make, and can be certainly life-threatening. Hallucinations are false sensory perceptions, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there. They have no apparent external cause, but they're real to that individual. These can be acute or chronic. They can result from brain damage, chemical imbalances, or substance abuse. Between 2006 and 2010, about 1 in 10 adults reported experienced frequent mental distress for 14 or more days. It's on the rise, the incidence of mental illness. Especially with the pandemic, there's been a lot of attention given to mental health and things like that. So this is certainly something that is talked about more, at least it seems now. So again, I'm sure these numbers have increased in more recent years, and especially with the pandemic in the past year or two. Depression and alcohol dependence are the most psychological disturbances that are reported, and the most significant barrier to treatment is cost. Not having health insurance or not having adequate health insurance, and not having access to care. So causes of psychological disorders, there's usually not one single cause of psychological illness. It's usually sort of a combination of multiple things. And some of those things could be an actual alteration of the brain, chemical environment, the way that the neurons are firing and the synapses are responding. There can actually be disturbances in the brain that can cause some of these psychological illnesses. There may be some genetics that play into this. Looking up and talking about schizophrenia, which we'll talk about at the end, there is usually a genetic tie to that. As I mentioned, brain damage from injuries, tumors, or infections can cause some different psychological disorders. drugs or substance abuse, such as cocaine, as well as multiple others. Extremely stressful experiences, particularly in childhood, especially things like abuse. If that happens in childhood, that certainly has a psychological impact on that child as they grow. And then environment, pollutants such as pesticides and toxic minerals like lead, mercury, arsenic, asbestos can have effects as well. Fewer than half of Americans who have been diagnosed with a psychological disorder seek treatment. Again, cost is a big barrier to that, and availability. And that is something that I think has been highlighted through the pandemic, and hopefully we'll see some reform or see some changes with that. Many people who do seek treatment will respond well to treatment, but many will also require long-term treatment. A lot of psychological disorders are not easily fixed. It's behavioral changes, it's coping strategies, it's therapy and counseling and things like that. And again, there's not a quick fix to many of these disorders. So again, I touched on some of the treatments. Again, it can involve a combination of counseling, which are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, group therapy, support groups, as well as some medications that can be used to treat some of these disorders as well. Here's a list of some of the major types of mental health therapists. So these are the different types of therapists. Again, the availability and the cost of seeing some of these therapists are the deterrents for some people being able to get the treatment that they need. And this chart is found on page 51 in your text. All right, so let's talk about some of the disorders that you might see. Anxiety disorders, we'll talk about those first. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is uncontrollable chronic worrying and nervousness. These are usually unrealistic fears, but they cause a person a great deal of anxiety. Phobias are intense, irrational fear of objects or situations. There are all types of phobias out there. Fear of spiders, fear of going outdoors, fear of other people. So you can Google a list of those, and there are some listed in your text as well. Panic disorders are someone who suffers from panic attacks, which are unpredictable episodes of extreme fear and loss of emotional control. These are usually a reaction to anxiety-provoking situations. So if they're put in a stressful situation, then they can be more prone to have a panic attack. All of these anxiety disorders are typically treated with behavioral therapy, and there are some medications that can help as well. Trauma and stress-related disorders are things like post-traumatic stress disorders, which is persistent arousal, avoidance, negative thoughts or feelings, and re-experiencing of traumatic events. This is often experienced by people who have survived extraordinary events. I think we associate this a lot with like soldiers and war and that post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can also be people who have survived a natural disaster or have survived abuse in the past. They can all experience PTSD. Acute stress disorder is severe anxiety, possible dissociation, decreased emotional responses, and feelings of guilt about pursuing usual life tasks. The person actually feels guilty about doing normal things. And adjustment disorders are feeling sad or experiencing actual physical symptoms like twitching, irregular heartbeats, when it's associated with a difficult life event, like a major change, death of a loved one, a change in job. Somebody actually starts to have physical symptoms like chest pains or things like that when everything with their heart is okay, right? So it's more of a psychological cause. A lot of people have heard of Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, or OCD, and this is when someone has repetitive thoughts that produce anxiety, and then they usually have some sort of obsessive behavior that they do, some sort of routine to help reduce that anxiety. It's often related to self-doubt or fears, and so you've probably seen or heard of different examples, people who have to count certain things or have to turn off the light before they leave a room so many times. And most of the times they recognize that this behavior is abnormal, but they feel compelled to do these things anyway. Hoarding disorder is difficulty discarding or parting with possessions due to the associated stress of getting rid of them. And this is, again, hoarding to the point of not being able to walk through your house, not being able to keep things clean because there's just so much stuff. And trichotillomania is the compulsive urge to pull out and in some cases even eat one's own hair. And actually, my little brother, my youngest brother, he had some of this when he was young. He was like elementary school aged. And people, his teacher at school noticed sometimes at school when he would get stressed, he would actually start to pull at his hair. And so fortunately for him, it was something that he outgrew and learned to cope and deal in other ways. With these types of disorders, typically the longer that someone experiences the symptoms, the more difficult it is to treat. So if the person can get treatment, again, the earlier, the better. This slide should actually be 2 slides. So we'll first talk about neurodevelopmental disorders, which would be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Gambling is a separate type of disorder that shouldn't really be on this slide, so we'll get to that in a minute. Neurodevelopmental orders are things we typically see in children. So ADD is what it used to be called, now it's ADHD, where kids usually, but this can persist into adulthood, have a short attention span. They have difficulty focusing on the task at hand or paying attention to the task. And it can result in serious social impairment. It can certainly result in some difficulties in school and intellectual development because they're having a hard time paying attention to task. Autism spectrum disorders would fall under neurodevelopmental disorders as well. And autism I'm not going to get into very much here because it is, again, it's a whole spectrum of disorders, and there are a ton of different symptoms. Everyone with autism sort of presents a little bit differently or is going to look a little bit different. Where gambling should fall is under addictive disorders. So this would be things like addictive gambling, substance abuse disorders. And this is where there's that compulsive and excessive need to gamble or consume alcohol or drugs. And it's going to disrupt personal, family, or vocational job pursuits. Men are more likely to have addictive disorders than females. And again, treatments for these are going to include typically like counseling and behavior-based therapy. Mood disorders, this is going to be depression, seasonal affective disorder, and bipolar disorder. Major depression affects about 16% of all American adults, and this is persistent and profound feelings, so very deep feelings of sadness, hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, not being able to do normal everyday things. Seasonal affective disorder is depression that results with lack of exposure to bright light. So this typically starts to affect individuals in late fall and runs through winter when the days are shorter, night is longer, gray, gloomy, cold weather, we're not outside as much. And so treatment for this can involve light therapy. And bipolar disorders, this is usually the periods of depression followed by periods of mania. So it's sort of alternating with maybe some sort of middle ground in between. Here are some typical symptoms of bipolar disorder. This is found on page 58 in your text. And again, most people are going to experience some of these symptoms on an occasional basis. But again, it's not to the extreme that someone with bipolar disorder would experience these same symptoms. Feeding and eating disorders, we're going to talk primarily here about anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. These are typically seen more in women than they are in men, and it's usually due to a distorted body image. So anorexia is a disorder in which individuals refuse to eat enough food to maintain a healthy body weight. So they're typically not eating or not eating very much or not eating foods that have a lot of calories. And so this table here lists some of the typical signs. They seem unaware of their body size. Again, sometimes called body dysmorphic disorder, where they see themselves as overweight when they're really not. They fear of losing control over their appetite. They may exercise excessively, anything to make sure that they're not putting on weight. And this chart is found on page 60 in your text. Bulimia is another type of eating disorder. It's characterized by a craving for food that's difficult to satisfy. It often involves eating excessive amounts of food, binging, and then purging or vomiting. So again, some of the signs of this, and this is on page 61 in your text, are going to be, again, seeing signs of eating large amounts of food, usually going to the bathroom right after they eat to vomit the food. They can have marks on their knuckles from putting their fingers down their throat to induce the vomiting. Their teeth can start to decay because of the acidity from the vomit. They may exercise excessively as well, and there may be some social withdrawal, avoiding social situations where people go out to eat because they don't want to have to do this in front of anybody. Binge eating disorder is the binging part of bulimia that we just talked about, but typically without the purging. So these are people who just binge eat. And we do typically see this more in obese individuals than we do in those that have a more healthy weight. The female athlete triad is typically having some type of disordered eating, whether it's anorexia or bulimia, which then causes them to be so lean and have so little body fat that they stop having menstrual cycles, and they also can develop osteopenia, which is a weakening of the bones. Muscle dysmorphia is a condition that affects weightlifters or bodybuilders. They are dissatisfied with their body. They may have disordered eating, sometimes eating too little, too much, weird combinations of foods, and excessive exercise, and potentially the abuse of steroids. They are attempting to build muscles as big as they possibly can. Again, most of the eating disorders are going to be treated with behavioral and cognitive type therapy. They are dangerous. They can all be life-threatening, so treatment is very important. To move into some of the psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, when I say schizophrenia, I know I thought right away, and a lot of people think right away, that this is that multiple personalities or split personalities, and that's not truly the case with schizophrenia. It is a mental disorder characterized by very disorganized thoughts, usual hallucinations and delusions, strange behaviors, inappropriate emotions, and possibly disjointed speech as well. They often hear voices. They're often paranoid or have paranoid beliefs, difficulty organizing their thoughts. Their speech is often garbled, so it can be very difficult to talk to them. They're saying words, but they're not really put in meaningful order. They may have a dull, monotonous voice, or they might not speak at all. They have an inability to focus attention and difficulty retaining information. There is, again, usually some biochemical or structural defect in the brain that can lead to schizophrenia. This is usually developed or diagnosed in adolescence or young adulthood. And the last thing we'll talk about is suicide. Suicide is not in itself a psychological disorder, but it is usually preceded by some other psychological problems, such as depression. People who commit suicide usually feel overwhelmed by life. They're unable to solve their own problems or adapt to the situation, and we do often see alcohol abuse or some other substance abuse in people who commit suicide. The suicide rate in this country has increased 24% in the last 15 years. It was the second leading cause of death for Americans between age 15 and 34. Males are 4 times more likely to kill themselves than females. Females are more likely to attempt suicide, but males are more likely to be successful. So how can we help? What can we do to help prevent suicide? We need to know to sort of recognize some of the symptoms or some of the what might put a person at risk. If a person is preoccupied with thoughts of death, if they communicate the intent to commit suicide, always, always, always take that seriously. Report it to someone. If they have a history of previous suicide attempts, if their family member had a suicide, if they're grieving excessively over the death of a loved one, if they have marital, financial problems, again, any big major life stressing event, we do want to take this seriously. So again, any sign, any mention of any of this, immediately seek help for the suicidal person. So that's on the next slide here. You can always call 911. They can get you in touch with a mental health center. They have people available 24 hours a day to help talk to someone who may be having suicidal thoughts. You can also visit the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline website, or there is a 1-800 number that you can call as well to try to get that person help. So this last table is on page 64 in the text, and this just talks about some of the behavioral warning signs of suicide. And again, if you notice someone who seems more withdrawn, who exhibits any of these signs, don't be afraid to try to get them help. It would be much better to try to get them help than to not do anything and have them actually go through with it. So, as always, if you guys have any questions, just let me know, and thanks for listening.